I'm Sean. I work for a company called Okta. I am a federal CSO, which is a fancy title for an old guy who tells people what to do in security. So I have responsibility for our federal environment. So Okta's been investing in federal market for many years. So we are a cloud identity provider, if you don't know. So we're a cloud identity platform. About 6, 7 years ago, we embarked on our federal journey. We rolled out a FedRAMP moderate environment. I would say we probably had no idea what we were doing, as most people don't when you start. A few years after that, we rolled out a FedRAMP high environment and a DoD IL4 environment, which I'm obligated to say, Sabrina's not here, I'm obligated to say our IL4 environment actually can service IL5 workloads. So if you're a mission partner and you have IL5 and you need an identity provider, we can still do that. Because we very purpose-built our environment for mission partners. It's very specific, it's very dedicated. We don't commingle our civilian and our DoD, so because of that, we actually can do IL5. So we learned a lot throughout this process, but what I'm going to talk about today is mostly kind of where we are, and the collective we, around the identity market space with regards to logging into stuff, and then we'll kind of go from there. So this is the thing I say in my team meetings all the time. This is hard for some people to kind of figure out, is that change is an inevitable thing. It either happens with you or to you. We like to believe that things are static and they persist and they always look the same and they always work the same, and we even do this inside our little commercial company, and it's never the same. And we all know this as we deal with federal regulation, which is changing. We deal with customer landscapes that are changing. We deal with technology landscapes that are changing very rapidly. And of course, I have to talk about AI because everyone talks about AI, and that's one of the things that it's kind of changing the way we do our business. And you can either grow with it or you can be run over by it. So it's really up to you. Identity is interesting, and I know a lot of us have been doing identity for a while, for many, many years. I will tell you, when I started my identity journey, I was working at a little company called Netscape. Anyone remember Netscape? They had this thing called a directory server. Directory server was an LDAP-based server. That was our identity platform. Back in those days, you used to get, identity was kind of like the prize in a box of Cracker Jacks. You buy an application, you got an identity. You buy 10 applications, you get 10 identity providers. And that's typically how they got rolled out. It's the whole reason why single sign-on exists now, so that you can stand up one identity provider. So I consider that kind of the first generation of identity. The second generation was when we figured out that identity was important from a security perspective, because initially we didn't really think that. If you remember way back in the day, we would do basic password hashing in a database. That was our security. We hashed a password. That was pretty cool. We thought that was security. And then we figured out that the attackers figured out way before we did that was pretty useful for them. You know, I think our CEO says this all the time, that attackers don't break into things, they log into things. So they don't actually, there's this kind of common misconception that attackers are wearing hoodies and they're sitting in dark rooms and they're typing with computers and their lights flashing behind them. That's not what attackers do. That's not who they are. They just basically go download some shit off the internet and they try to break into your things by logging into stuff. They got the passwords, they got the usernames, that's really all they've ever needed. So the second generation of identity was adding security to this. So consider multi-factor authentication, other things that we've added into security. Not every MFA is created equal, but that was kind of the second generation. What I'm talking about now is the kind of the third age of identity, which is building identity to be smarter. And this is where things like AI and other components come in. The guidance around multi-factor authentication is pretty old. It came out in 2022, but we've been talking about MFA for 10 years. It's been a slow burn to adopt up until the last couple of years, just because it does add user friction. So that's one of the things we always have to balance is we have to do the right security things, but we also have to figure out how we provide less user friction. And MFA is user friction. So that's been kind of the balancing act we've had. Now it's accelerated over the last handful of years because it's had to. CISA and other people have come out and said, you got to do this, because if not, people are just logging into your stuff, and that's not good. We see a lot of threat actors in the wild doing a lot of bad things. We have a defensive cyber operations team that looks at this stuff. And these guys they run the gamut from the APT guys from Russia, so nation state people, all the Chinese, and there's a whole bunch of coalition attackers that we see coming out, and a lot of them are financial based, which so they're coming after financial resources. They're leveraging all the latest and greatest technologies. So think of everything that we want to do from a defensive perspective, and the attackers have already been doing this from an offensive perspective for years. We get many instances where we see kind of deep fake audio of our CEO all the time. It happens quite frequently. We're going to start seeing deep fake video of our CEO, where he's going to try to do like a Zoom recording and send that to our team and say, hey, I'm Todd, I need to log into this thing, I'm stuck somewhere, please let me log into this. So the whole aspect of the social engineering that's happening is really getting interesting. And these guys are well resourced and well funded and able to do all this stuff. And I say this from the perspective of, this is why we got to get identity right, because identity is really going to be the front door and the first line of defense for keeping these guys out, along with user education, user experience of how to spot these kinds of things. But I will tell you, spotting these things is getting harder and harder. And we spend a lot of time putting a lot of the onus on our users to be the front line of security, and we have to be careful with that because there's a lot of fatigue around it, and plus the fidelity of these things are becoming so good that users are having a tough time. I always recommend that people go out and kind of read some of the forensic information that exists around threats and threats landscapes and things that have happened. This is a really good report. So the CSRB that got put together a couple of years ago has put together some stellar reports around threats and things that have happened. This one's interesting because they call it an exchange intrusion, which I guess at the end of the day it is. That's what they were going for. But this is actually an identity intrusion. This is actually kind of a poster child or a textbook example of how not to do identity in your organization, specifically across boundaries between a commercial and an enterprise and all these different things. There's so many great lessons learned. A lot of the things that when they get to the end and they kind of talk about the summary and some of the things you should do to prevent this kind of stuff, a lot of it's the meat and potatoes of use phishing resistant authentication, don't cross the streams between your commercial side and your business side. Deploy strong single sign-on. Don't rely on kind of weak factors and weak single sign-on. Make sure you're using verifiable initiator kind of SSO type of stuff. So if you think about kind of OIDC with demonstrable proof of possession and all those kinds of things, they recommend a lot of those best practices. But to me, it's good to just kind of read forensically what the attackers are doing. I mean, kind of what their behaviors are, kind of what they're going after, what their motivations are. And this is a really good report for that. I mentioned we put all of our onus on end users for security. And when we're starting to do that again, and we should stop, the first one was the passwords I talked about, right? You tell your users, have a strong password, change it every 7 days, don't repeat it. I mean, that's great for you. It's easy for you to do an edict. It's hard for your users. It's hard for me as a user to do that because I'm gonna, I can't remember. We talk about passphrases. Use a passphrase. It's still hard to remember passphrases. I'm sorry, it just is. We're people. I got to log into 20 things. Single sign-on's great, but it doesn't cover everything that I do. So telling me as the user that I'm the most responsible party for this is not really great. And again, back to the kind of the whole deep fake conversation, the whole if you see something that you know is wrong, then say something. What if you don't know it's wrong? What if that looks like Todd? What if that sounds like Todd? What if I'm working with Todd day in, day out, and this is the kind of thing Todd would say? You're relying on me to be, have a crystal ball that I just don't have. So we can't put the onus on the users. We got to help the users do better behaviors. So this is not, and that's probably me in 2 years, maybe if I'm lucky. This is not your dad's, your granddad's identity. It's their identity. The world is changing. It is a digital world. So when Madonna sings, I am a material girl, I am a digital girl. It's a digital world we live in. It's not changing, it's not going back. I mean, this is where I live, and that's a really crappy picture of my California mobile driver's license, but that is my California mobile driver's license. We're now living in a world where I do everything here. I do everything on my phone and my watch, and I'm not really wanting to think about or concentrate on, what's my threat posture as a user. Sure, I'm going to think about some of those things, but I just want to get things done. I want to pay for my Starbucks. I want to look at my bank account. I want to travel. I want to log into my room when I get to the Hilton at 1 o'clock in the morning. I don't want to have to think about any of that stuff. And I'm going to become to a point where, and Jordan, we used to talk about this. I remember Grassi used to say, the bring my own identity. We're now entering a world where users are going to bring their own identity. And you're going to provide an ability for them to access something, but you're not necessarily going to be the steward of that credential anymore. You might be for some of it, but you might not be for all of it. And this world is coming fast. This is every state either has a plan to do this or is starting to do this. California, Maryland, a few others are kind of ahead of the game on it a little bit, but everyone will do it eventually. And you're going to have to figure out, we're all going to have to figure out, how does that federate? How does that work in the common world we live in today? And how do we make sure this is secure? How do we make sure these users are using these things in a secure way and no one can take advantage of this and get that credential? So how do we at Okta think about this? Because we think about this every single day, because this is all we do for a living. When I wake up in the morning, and Todd wakes up in the morning, and my boss wakes up in the morning, we're thinking about how do we provide identity? How do we provide it securely? How do we provide it easy for folks to use? And the way we think about it is that this is where the rubber meets the road always. This is where the threats are happening. Sure, we can all talk about the fact that there are a lot of 0 days people talk about. There are a lot of vulnerabilities that happen. We all look at the NVD database and see all the vulnerabilities are there, and some of them certainly exploited. But at the end of the day, if your easiest path to your goal is to just figure out what someone's login is and log into the database and look like a legitimate user, you can bypass all the stuff you put in your infrastructure. There is no detector or sensor or anything that's going to help you in that context, which is why identity has to be smarter. It has to be smarter. It also has to be easier. And this is not easy. We as security people, we tell people, you got to do the right security thing, and we're all really good at making it hard for users. We've been good for years making it hard for users. We got to start thinking about how to make it easier. So we roll out, we've got, just like our friends at Ping have a passwordless solution. We all have passwordless solutions, but we're building a lot of fidelity and detections into our passwordless solution. So that way, it's a smart passwordless solution. All it requires the user to do, if everything's right with the world, the only thing the user has to do is Touch ID or Face ID and log in. Magic happens, they get access to all their stuff. If anything wrong happens in the world, meaning that the transaction has been compromised or for some reason you're coming from a place that you normally don't come from, maybe some friction is warranted. But we don't add friction for friction's sake. We only do it if context has changed. And we have to be able to do that very quickly. So we think about, and this is where I'm going to talk a little bit about AI, because everyone has to talk about AI. So how can we make that decision quicker? How can we make it, because the other thing we always run into, and a lot of these conferences, I'll talk to people and they'll say, it takes me 5 minutes to log into my stuff. And that's 5 minutes of productivity I'm missing. But not only that, it's just, it's just a pain in the butt to do that, because every time I log into something, it takes me 5 minutes. And I'm saying 5 minutes graciously, because I've had some people tell me 10 or 15. So how do we make this wire speed, and how do we make this full fidelity? So this is the thing we have to focus on. So a lot of this is based upon open standards that we have. So this concept of shared signaling or shared signal framework is the ability for us to do this continuous assessment. So when we're doing our passwordless authentication and we're doing all that magic for the user and they look at something with Face ID and it magically logs in, behind the scenes, we're doing a lot of checks. Right location, right device, right person, right this, right that. Does CrowdStrike think it's okay? Does Zscaler think it's okay? Does Socure think it's okay? Does everybody think this is okay? If everyone thinks it's okay and we all agree to this, that user sees no friction. That user just magically looks at his iPhone and stuff just happens. If Socure says it's not okay, if Zscaler says it's not okay, if it's a different location, if I've logged in from the same location for 4 years, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, and all of a sudden I'm on a Sunday and I'm in Uzbekistan, that is different. If it's different, maybe I add some friction. Maybe there's a speed bump. And the speed bump might be something very benign. It might be, hey, I'm going to make you auth again. Or, hey, I'm going to ask for another factor. Or, hey, I'm going to wait for a period of time and I'm going to notify a SOC and let them know that you've tried to come in from Uzbekistan, and they can determine, oh, yeah, he's traveling. Or, no, he's not traveling. So being able to make that decision in kind of wire speed, real time, is super important. And it's not easy, because this continuous thing that happens, it's going to add some time. And again, we don't want to get back to the situation where it takes me 10 minutes to log in. It's got to be seconds for this to happen. So this is where we apply kind of the machine learning Okta AI capability we have for this. So this is kind of generative based upon the data that we see. And we started this journey several years ago with a capability we call Threat Insight. So Threat Insight is kind of looking at the auths that we see, because we see millions and millions and millions of auths a day, and looking at kind of what the behavior patterns are. And those behavior patterns might inform some of the decisions that we make across the board. And of course, like everything else, this is opt-in, opt-out, so customers can say, you know what, I'm good, I can make my own decisions, I'll use some other things like the shared signal framework and some other things to make decisions. But if you want to opt into this, we know some things about what behavior looks like and what auth looks like, and our DCO guys are kind of pumping into the system some things they see from a threat perspective, and Okta AI can make that determination. So we are adding this into a couple different flavors of things that we do. One is the identity threat protection. The other thing is log analysis, because we have an amazing log, but it is noisy. It's got a lot of stuff in there. And being able to find what you want, sure, we could pipe it out to Splunk, we can pipe it out to EventBridge, you can go look for some things, but it still requires an operator to go look for some things, and sometimes people just don't have time. So you can tune the log analyzer to be able to say, I'm looking for something that might look like a threat across these countries, and the log analyzer will start looking for these things. And then it'll start learning based upon things that you're talking about, what it might want to notify you of the future. The other area where AI is going to be super important is policy creation, because as we all know, policies can get pretty complex. You want to have a policy for this application. You might have a different policy for a different group of users. You might have a different policy for step-up authentication if you find some weird behavior. So policy determination is another area where AI can help you. You can kind of speak like a human and say, I'd like a policy that does this, and the AI can say, here's what a policy would look like that does that. To help you create policies. Because these policies, again, are not going to get any less complex. They're only going to get more complex. So it's important that this ends up being a community effort to put all this stuff together. We as Okta don't live in a vacuum. We work with all the technology companies for this. We work very closely with some of the first tier companies like Amazon, Google, and Apple to make sure that we're sharing signals. They're sharing signals to us. We work with a lot of other companies that sit in different areas. So Socure is sitting on the identity proofing stack, Zscaler on the secure web gateway stack, CrowdStrike on the EDR endpoint stack. So being able to make sure that we're having a common language is super important here. And not only that, we have to make sure we're adhering to that. Because what ends up happening is it's always easier to do your own thing. It's always easier to say, I'm just going to do this my way. All my products work really well together. We only have one product. We're an identity platform, so we got to work with everybody else. So for us, this makes the most sense so that you and everyone can choose the applications that make the most sense to do your business. You want to use Workday for HR? Use Workday. You want to use Salesforce? Use Salesforce. You want to use, pick a technology you use that technology. And leveraging the standards and leveraging the security shared signal standards are going to be important for us being able to kind of share information. And this is going to continue. Again, no one can do everything. I don't care who you are and how much money you got. And I'm looking at Redmond, Washington. I don't care how much money you got. You cannot do everything well. So I talked about defense in depth. I talked about kind of adding context to the flow. These are all kind of super important things that I think that most people kind of take for granted and don't think about when they're doing identity. Most people think of identity as, that's my front door, someone's going to log in, I give them access to the stuff. It's super important to not only think about the letting in, but it's also the getting out. So we've had single sign-on for a long time. It's actually kind of one of the things that it's amazing, but it's also fraught with peril, because if you get access to the single sign-on solution, you get access to whatever's behind it. So the concept of the single get them out is also important. This is another standard that we've been driving along with some of our other industry partners, of the concept of a universal logout. So taking an action, if you see something nefarious, and that could be one of your kind of flow-through actions. So again, add a little speed bump in the beginning, and then a bigger speed bump, big stop sign, big Heisman at the end is, everything went to crap, I'm going to log you out of everything. So that should be an action or a function that you're able to do across all of your application. And this takes some work. This is not easy. This is not a simple thing, because this requires all of your application providers to get on board. It requires all of your identity providers to get on board. And we have to be having that open technology conversation between the technologies to be able to do this. It's not a simple thing. It's not like single sign-on, which is pretty simple. This is very complex, but it's very necessary. So one more thing for all Steve Jobs fans out there, and I mentioned this earlier, you can't do security without identity. It's just not possible. If you don't get identity right, I mean, you can screw up a lot of things in your environment, but you cannot screw up your identity, because that is, again, the front door. It's where all the attackers are going to spending their energy. They're not spending their energy, most of them are not spending their energy on the really super obscure 0 days. I mean, you know, if anyone's ever studied kind of the Pegasus group and what they do for 0 days on iOS devices and all that stuff, that's really cool stuff, but that's really expensive and really bespoke. If I'm a mom and pop shop, no one's coming after me with Pegasus. That just doesn't make any sense. What they're coming after me with is they're coming after me with my logins, because they figured out I'm using the same login for Gmail as I'm using for my bank, and they're just going to go take my money because they go where the money is. That's what attackers do. The other thing I will mention is that out of all these things, and as we put this together, and thanks Sean Connolly for putting together the pillars, and the pillars are all important, but identity is the most important pillar. It's pillar one for a reason. When we all put this thing together, we said identity is pillar one for a reason, because you have to do this first. You want to focus on secure web gateway? Great. You want to focus on microsegmentation? Great. You want to focus on your devices and device posture? Great. But if you don't do identity right, all those things are pretty much meaningless. Which is why we kind of think about it as identity-focused or identity-centric security. And that's kind of the world we live in. And that's all I got. I think I'm good. Look at that. I finished right on time. I didn't even know I was going to do that. Okay, thank you guys. Appreciate it.